Welcome to the CACFP meal pattern training. This session will focus specifically on the requirements surrounding the new infant meal patterns, which will go into effect on October 1st, 2017. Copies of this PowerPoint, as well as additional training materials, can be found at the website listed on the screen. Additional training materials will be available through the RIDE Child Nutrition Program's website. USDA has made some policy updates to the child and adult meal patterns, including the meal pattern for infants ages 0 through 11 months. The updated child and adult meal pattern requirements, which were published in April of 2016, focus on ensuring children and adults have access to healthy, balanced meals throughout the day. Specifically, the changes provide wider varieties of protein options, greater varieties of vegetables and fruits, more whole grains, and less added sugar and saturated fat. Today we will talk about these changes as they relate to the infant meal pattern. The updated meal patterns continue to dictate the required components and minimum portion sizes that must be served as part of a reimbursable meal for each meal period. As you can see from this comparison chart, there have been several changes to the infant meal pattern, including changes to the age groupings, required portion sizes, and required meal components for a reimbursable infant meal. We will be discussing each of these changes in depth throughout the training. Now that we've looked generally at the new meal pattern for infants as compared to the current meal pattern, let's move on to review some of the specific infant meal pattern requirements. There are three major updates in the infant meal pattern requirements. First, they encourage and support breastfeeding by providing additional reimbursement when mothers breastfeed on site. Second, they promote developmentally appropriate meals by separating the infant age groups into 2 age groups instead of 3. Third, they provide meals that are more nutritious to promote the development of healthy eating habits by requiring vegetables and fruits to be served at snack, disallowing juice, cheese food, and cheese spreads as creditable items, and allowing yogurt and whole eggs to credit as meat alternates. Let's begin by exploring the age groups. As I mentioned, the previous meal patterns featured 3 age groups. However, the updated infant meal pattern requirements now feature only 2 age groups, birth through the end of 5 months and 6 months through the end of 11 months. These changes align the CACFP meal pattern with the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendations as well as the infant age groups used for WIC. Additionally, the new infant age groups are designed to help delay the introduction of solid foods until about 6 months of age. You'll notice that unlike many regulatory requirements that dictate service in a very black and white fashion, when talking about infants and the introduction of solid foods, I use the word about when referring to the time that solid foods should be introduced. Throughout this entire presentation, it is extremely important to remember that when discussing the eating habits of infants, each individual infant should drive the process. There are certain regulatory requirements that must be met under the new CACFP meal patterns, but much of the infant feeding process is going to be dependent on what the infant is developmentally ready to receive. We will talk about developmental readiness in further depth later in this presentation. There are several advantages for having 2 age groups. Let's review some of these advantages and how they would apply when serving infants. First, the updated infant meal pattern requirements encourage breastfeeding. Breast milk is the optimal source of nutrients for infants, and as mentioned, it is generally the only source of nutrients infants need for healthy growth and development during the first 6 months of life. Therefore, breast milk or formula is the only required food component for infants between the age of birth through the end of 5 months. For all meals and snacks serve infants between the ages of birth through the end of 5 months, a minimum of 4 to 6 fluid ounces of breast milk or infant formula. Another advantage of having 2 age groups is it helps to delay the introduction of solid foods until around 6 months when infants are developmentally ready to accept them. The previous infant meal pattern requirements allowed solid foods to be introduced as early as 4 months of age. However, if infants are introduced to solid foods before they are developmentally ready, the risk of being overweight or obese later in life increases. Also, infants need time to develop the skills to eat solid foods, and most infants are not ready to consume solid foods until midway through the first year. Therefore, the 2 age groups support that infants will be developmentally ready to accept solid foods before, at, or after 6 months of age. Through around 6 months, though around 6 months is recommended time frame for introducing solid foods. As I mentioned earlier, each individual infant should be driving their own individual process. If there is a 5-month-old infant at your center and you and the parent both agree that he or she is ready to begin solid foods, those meals could still be reimbursable provided that you meet the minimum meal pattern requirements and maintain the proper documentation. Alternately, if there is a 7-month-old child at your center and you and the parents both agree that he or she is not ready to be introduced to solid foods, these meals can be reimbursable as well as long as the proper documentation is maintained. The USDA memo, CACFP 23-2016, Feeding Infants and Meal Pattern Requirements in the CACFP Questions and Answers, which is available on the RIDE Child Nutrition webpage, provides some great additional clarifications around developmental readiness, including questions and answers about specific situations that your center might encounter. In addition to encouraging breastfeeding and focusing on developmental readiness, the updated infant meal pattern requirements allow more nutritious foods. Specifically, foods from all of the food components may be served to infants around 6 months, as it is developmentally appropriate. During breakfast, lunch, and supper meals, the following 3 food components must be offered to infants when they are developmentally ready to accept them: breast milk or iron-fortified infant formula, infant cereal, meat alternates, or a combination, and vegetables, fruits, or a combination of both. During snacks, there are 3 food components: breast milk or iron-fortified infant formula, grains, and vegetables, fruits, or a combination of both. Except for breast milk and infant formula, the serving sizes for all food components for meals and snacks begin with 0 for infants 6 to 11 months. This serving size recognizes that not all infants are ready to eat solid foods right at 6 months of age and may need additional time before they are developmentally ready. It is important to note that by 7 or 8 months of age, most infants should consume solid foods from all food groups. Communication with parents will be key throughout this process. Many centers may choose to have parents update an infant feeding preference form on a regular basis as a best practice for supporting documentation for which foods are developmentally appropriate for each infant in care. The last advantage we will cover is that the 2 age groups focus on the infant eating habits. Specifically, the serving size also allows you to feed infants based on their eating habits with the understanding that their eating habits may change. For example, some infants may eat certain foods this week but will not eat the same food the next week. This meal should not be disallowed as long as the meal offered is consistent with the infant's eating habits. We will discuss this advantage further later in the lesson. Let's move on to discuss the individual components that make up the infant meal pattern, starting with breast milk and formula. The updated infant meal pattern requirements encourage and promote breastfeeding in 2 key ways. First, you may continue to claim infant meals for reimbursement when a parent or guardian supplies expressed breast milk for their infant and you feed the infant the expressed milk. This requirement is currently in effect for infant meals. Secondly, effective October 1st, 2017, you may begin to claim reimbursement for meals when a mother breastfeeds her infant on site at the child care facility. When a mother breastfeeds in the child care facility, it is not required that you measure and record the amount of breast milk a mother breastfeeds her infant. However, you should write breastfed on site, mother on site, or a similar statement in places where you would normally write the amount of expressed breast milk served to the infant. This documentation can be maintained on existing forms in use at the center. When serving expressed milk, there may be times when an infant does not consume the entire serving. For example, some breastfed infants consume less than the minimum serving size of breast milk for each feeding. In these situations, you may offer infants less than the minimum serving size of breast milk. However, you must offer the additional breast milk later if the infant will consume more for a reimbursable meal. Although not new, it is important to note that infants should be fed on demand and not on a strict schedule. Therefore, feed infants during a span of time consistent with their eating habits. In addition, avoid force-feeding infants, as this may cause them to consume more than they need. When infants are not breastfed or they need a supplement for breast milk, iron-fortified infant formula is the best alternative. Iron is a very important nutrient for infants during their first year because it supports healthy brain development and growth. The infant meal pattern requirements allows an infant younger than 12 months to be served iron-fortified formula, breast milk, or a combination of both. Therefore, if a mother wishes not to breastfeed or is unable to produce enough breast milk to satisfy the infant, iron-fortified formula should be served in place of or in supplement to breast milk. All child care programs must continue to offer a minimum of one type of iron-fortified infant formula. When selecting formula, all infant formula must be regulated by the Food and Drug Administration to be creditable in the CACFP. Any iron-fortified infant formula bought in a store in the U.S. and all formula marketed in the U.S. is regulated by FDA. However, formula purchased outside of the U.S. may not be regulated by FDA. Therefore, these formulas may not be creditable in the CACFP. When serving formula, some infants may not consume the entire serving. However, as long as you offer the minimum serving size, the meal is reimbursable. As previously mentioned, the minimum serving size may be offered over a period of time rather than in a single setting, as long as what is offered is consistent with the infant's eating habits and is appropriately documented. A participant does not need to consume the minimum serving size of a food component in order for the meal to be reimbursable. Any leftovers should be properly stored based on your local health and safety requirements. Due to a disability, some infants may not be able to consume breast milk or iron-fortified infant formulas. In situations when an infant, child, or adult participant has a disability, you must make reasonable modifications to meal service. To receive reimbursement for milk substitutions or other meal modifications that are outside of the meal pattern requirements due to a disability, the modifications must be supported by a written medical statement signed by a state-recognized medical authority, such as a physician who is authorized to write medical prescriptions under state law. The statement should explain the need for the modification, provide guidance for the substitution or meal modification, and be kept on file by the CACFP Center or Family Child Care Home. Please reach out to a nutrition program specialist if you have additional questions regarding a request for modification due to a disability. Remember, centers must provide reasonable modifications for children with disabilities. Parents cannot be required to provide their own modification and/or pay for the modification that the center is implementing. Additionally, a center may not simply deny program participation based on an identified disability. Now that we've discussed breast milk and formula, let's move on to discuss the fruits and vegetable component. There are two significant updates to the fruit and vegetable component of infant meals. Vegetables and fruits are great sources of essential nutrients such as fiber and vitamin C. Currently, vegetables and fruits are required at breakfast, lunch, and supper meals for infants who are developmentally ready to accept them, around 6 months of age. In the updated infant meal pattern requirements, 0 to 2 tablespoons of vegetables, fruits, or a combination of both must be offered during snacks when infants are developmentally ready to accept them. This change promotes vegetable and fruit consumption in infants, and it allows for better acceptance later in life. The second change to the fruit and vegetable component of the infant meal pattern centers around juice. Juice lacks dietary fiber found in other forms of fruits and vegetables. When infants drink too much juice, they are more likely to experience diarrhea, abdominal pain, and other gastrointestinal problems. Therefore, the updated meal pattern requirements no longer credit juice as a reimbursable item for infant meals. The next component that we will discuss is meat alternates. Some common examples of meat alternates include poultry, meat, yogurt, cheese, whole eggs, and dry beans. The updated meal pattern requirements for the meat alternate component focus on yogurt, whole eggs, and cheese foods and spreads. Let's begin by exploring yogurt. Yogurt is a great source of protein, and this macronutrient provides energy, builds and maintains muscle, and it promotes a healthy metabolism. Because of the benefits of protein and the popularity of yogurt, the updated meal pattern requirements now allow yogurt as a meat alternate for infants as they are developmentally ready to accept it. When serving yogurt, offer 0 to 4 ounces during breakfast, lunch, or supper meals. Note that all yogurts included as part of a reimbursable meal in CACFP must contain no more than 23 grams of sugar per 6 ounces of yogurt. For more information on this requirement, please refer to the yogurt handout and/or the recorded meat alternate webinar available on the RIDE Child Nutrition website. Eggs are also a great source of protein. Previously, there was a concern that the protein in egg whites may cause an allergic reaction. However, the AAP recently concluded that there is no convincing evidence to delay the introduction of foods that are considered major food allergens, such as eggs. Therefore, the updated infant meal pattern requirements allow 0 to 4 tablespoons of whole eggs to credit towards a reimbursable meal. Next, 0 to 2 ounces of cheese and cottage cheese credit as a meat alternate in the updated infant meal pattern. Some common examples of cheese may include shredded or sliced Swiss, Colby, and Monterey Jack. However, certain cheese items have significantly higher amounts of sodium than others. Eating too many foods high in sodium can lead to heart disease, stroke, and hypertension. Therefore, the updated infant meal pattern requirements disallow the service of cheese foods or cheese spreads for infant meals. It is important to note cheese foods are still allowable for children and adults, but not for participants under 1 year of age. Non-creditable items may be identified by reading the product's packaging for the wording imitation cheese, cheese food, or cheese product on the food label, such as cheese whiz pimento, and cream cheese. Refer to the USDA Food Buying Guide for child nutrition programs or the USDA Crediting Handbook to help you identify approved cheese items. The last component that we will discuss is the grains component. During the first year, grains such as iron-fortified infant cereals can be a great source of essential nutrients such as B vitamins, zinc, and magnesium. Iron-fortified infant cereals are often the first solid foods introduced to infants because they are easily digested and are filled with essential nutrients. When infants are developmentally ready, serve 0 to 4 tablespoons of iron-fortified infant cereal for a reimbursable meal. The updated infant meal pattern requirements allow breads, crackers, and now ready-to-eat cereals to credit for snack meals only. When choosing to serve ready-to-eat cereals at snack, it must contain no more than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce to be reimbursable. For more information on the sugar requirement for cereals, please refer to the cereal handout and/or grains webinar recording available on the RIDE Child Nutrition Program website. Now that we have reviewed each of the components of the meal pattern, let's move on to discuss developmental readiness. Introducing solid foods is a very important step for infants, parents, and guardians. It is vital that infants are developmentally ready for solid foods before introducing them. Introducing solid foods too early may cause infants to choke on the food because they are not physically able to consume solid foods and consume less breast milk or formula and not get enough calories and other nutrients for proper growth and development. Therefore, it is important to serve solid foods to infants when they are developmentally ready. The American Academy of Pediatrics is the leading authority for children's development and nutrition needs from birth through 23 months of age. They found that there is no direct signal to determine when an infant is developmentally ready to accept solid foods. However, the AAP provides these guidelines to determine when an infant is developmentally ready to accept solid foods. When the infant is able to sit in a high chair, feeding seat, or infant seat with good head control, opens their mouth when food comes their way, the infant may watch others eat, reach for food, and seem eager to be fed, moves food from a spoon into the throat, and doubles in weight. Working with parents or guardians helps to ensure that all newly introduced foods are appropriate for each individual infant and are consistent with their eating habits and developmental readiness. Always consult with parents or guardians about when and what solid foods to introduce to infants. When communicating with parents and guardians, you may wish to use the AAP's Developmental Readiness Guidelines as a way to show the infant may be ready for solid foods. Additionally, it is recommended that providers request a written statement from parents or guardians outlining when and which solid foods to serve to each infant. This optional statement will help you to know what to do to meet the needs of the infants and follow the preferences of parents and guardians. This documentation can also be useful in the administrative review process to demonstrate that each infant is being fed according to his or her individual feeding habits. When discussing infant feeding habits with parents, it is also a great time to discuss the food parents or guardians may wish to provide. Previously, a parent or guardian could provide all but one component and the meal was still reimbursable. However, the updated meal pattern requirements allow parents and guardians to provide only one food component for a reimbursable meal. If parents or guardians wish to provide more than one component, the meal would then not be reimbursable. Note that breast milk, either expressed or from a mother breastfeeding on site, will count as the one parent provided component for an infant meal. Although infants have unique dietary needs and parents or guardians are often most in touch with their infant's dietary preferences, this change will help ensure child care settings are not encouraging or requiring parents or guardians to supply the food in order to reduce costs. Specifically, it helps maintain the integrity of the CACFP. Once an infant is developmentally ready to accept solid foods, you must offer the food to the infant. Begin by gradually introducing solid foods one at a time and over the course of a few days. Because solid foods are introduced gradually, this means that when an infant is just starting to eat solid foods, it may be appropriate to offer solid foods at only one meal per day. An infant does not need to be offered a solid food component that is part of the meal pattern, such as vegetables and fruit, until the infant has established a tolerance for that food component. In addition to the gradual introduction of solid foods, centers should also prepare foods in the right texture and consistency appropriate for the age and development of each infant, and observe each infant closely for reactions after feeding a new food. If there is a reaction, stop feeding the food and discuss this with the parents or guardians. Consult with the parent or guardians who should contact their baby's doctor before introducing that food in the future. Now that we've reviewed the meal pattern requirements, we will move on to discuss some optional best practices. In addition to the revision of the CACFP meal pattern requirements, USDA has also developed some best practices that build on the meal pattern requirements to further improve the nutritional quality of all meals. The best practices reflect recommendations from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans and the National Academy of Medicine. The best practices are optional. However, USDA highly encourages all CACFP centers and daycare homes to implement these best practices in order to ensure children and adults are getting the optimal benefit from the meals served. Failure to comply with the best practices cannot result in a meal disallowance or a serious deficiency finding. As we learned, breastfeeding is the ideal source of nutrients for infants because it provides the essential nutrients needed for healthy growth and development. As a best practice, child care providers are encouraged to support mothers who choose to breastfeed their infants by encouraging mothers to supply breast milk while their infants are in child care, and providing a quiet, private area that is comfortable, safe, and sanitary for mothers to breastfeed at the facility. As we've discussed, the best practices are designed to build on the meal pattern requirements. Although they are not required, implementing the best practices shows your commitment to going the extra mile to ensure those in your care are provided nutritious meals. Fortunately, implementing the best practices can be made easy when you establish a plan and put it into action. Whether you choose to implement these best practices or not, your center should develop an overall action plan for implementing the new meal pattern. Having a clear plan will help you and your staff to understand the requirements and ensure compliance throughout the menu planning, shopping, preparation, and meal serving process. Now that we've reviewed the changes to the new CACFP meal pattern for infants, let's talk about how to document compliance at your center. Before we look at specific examples of acceptable infant documentation, let's review the checklist for implementing the new infant meal pattern. The checklist shown on screen is available on the RIDE Child Nutrition website. You want to ensure that juice is not included on any planned menu for infants. Also, that you are not including any non-creditable food items, such as cheese food, on any infant menus. You need to ensure that only iron-fortified, FDA-regulated infant formula or breast milk are included as part of reimbursable meal for infants. You need to ensure that yogurt contains no more than 23 grams of sugar per 6 ounces. Also ensure that any ready-to-eat breakfast cereal contains no more than 6 grams of sugar per dry ounce. Any infant cereal included as part of a reimbursable meal must be iron fortified. Tofu is not creditable as part of any infant meal. Infants must be offered all required meal pattern components as they are developmentally ready to accept them. Serving sizes offered must be correct for each age group. and staff must be trained on appropriate documentation for mothers who choose to breastfeed on site. Additionally, parents must provide no more than one meal component, including breast milk, as part of a reimbursable infant meal. The center must offer at least one variety of creditable infant formula. All infants in care at the time of service must be offered participation in the CACFP. Medical statements must be maintained on file for any modifications to infant meals that are not compliant with meal pattern requirements. Lastly, documentation of specific food items and quantities offered to each infant on a daily basis at each meal period must be maintained on-site at the center. Now that we've reviewed the compliance checklist, we will move on to look at some samples of acceptable infant documentation. Appropriate documentation for infant feeding in the CACFP will meet all of the criteria as shown on the screen. Note that there is no one required form that must be used by centers when documenting infant meals. Many, if not all, centers are already producing individual documentation for each infant based on what is consumed at each meal period. It is acceptable to edit existing forms used in the center as long as all required CACFP information is recorded. Just remember, for CACFP documentation, what the infant is offered as opposed to what the infant actually consumes is required. Additionally, this documentation must be maintained on-site at the center and be available for review by RIDE Child Nutrition Program staff. So if you are producing documentation that is then sent home with the family and a copy is not maintained on-site at the center, this would not meet CACFP requirements. As you can see on the screen, documentation must be individual to the infant, include the infant's name and date of birth, document the amount of food offered at each meal period, include specific information on food items served, such as writing applesauce as opposed to fruit, must denote any parent-provided meal components, and it must be maintained on-site at the center for at least 3 years plus the current year. The most comprehensive sample infant documentation form, shown on the screen, closely mimics the 5-day menu template that RIDE provides for implementation of the CACFP child meal patterns. This form is available in Word format and could be printed, including all of the relevant information on the top portion of the form, such as the child's name and date of birth, in advance of service. Then, the teacher would be responsible only for indicating the type and quantity of food items served on each day. When used correctly, all required information on the top of the form is filled out completely. The date has been entered ahead of each day. The first line indicates the amount and uses the letters BM to denote breast milk as opposed to formula, and also indicates an asterisk to indicate that this is the one parent-provided component for this meal. The type of fruit and quantity are specified. Half a cup is denoted in the cottage cheese line, so no additional information is needed outside of the portion size. Note, on Tuesday in this example, the parent did not provide enough breast milk to meet the minimum serving size that the infant is developmentally ready to receive, 8 ounces, and so formula was provided as a supplement to meet the minimum meal pattern requirement. For the meat alternate on this day, the food item served is an egg and is specified along with the quantity. So again, you can see on this cottage cheese line right here that this is the only component that could go with that line, and so a half a cup is sufficient. You don't need any additional written words. But on the line above this, on the next day, there are many different food items that could fall into this category, and so both the serving size and the specific food item served are marked in this column. This sample form also includes helpful reminders about the new infant meal pattern on the reverse side. Even if you do not elect to use this sample form, you may want to consider printing out these reminders for use in infant classrooms. Some centers may choose to reduce the amount of paperwork required for infant documentation and will elect to document multiple infants on one form for each serving day. This form does not contain information on the minimum required serving sizes, and so teachers must be well trained and/or have alternate resources available to provide them with this information. In this example, the teacher completes the date at the top of the form and fills out the information for each infant served at each meal period. The top of the form provides a spot for totaling CACFP meals served to help with the claiming process. Infant names and ages could be typed into the form ahead of time to save time when documenting at meal service. However, be sure that only the students actually in attendance and served a meal are counted. Notice that Johnny C. is right at the 6-month age when he would likely be showing signs of developmental readiness for solid foods. As long as the serving sizes recorded are consistent with the infant's eating habits and developmental readiness, this meal would still be considered reimbursable. Also note that for Johnny C., the parent-provided component is applesauce. Because Johnny is given formula provided by the center, and so applesauce is able to be the only parent-provided component to make this meal reimbursable. If his parents had provided both applesauce and breast milk, this meal would not be considered reimbursable under CACFP guidelines and would not be included in the total daily meal count. Remember, parents may elect to provide components as part of a reimbursable meal under CACFP, but cannot be required to provide any components as part of this program. And only one parent-provided component is allowable for a meal to be claimed for reimbursement. So again, in this example, you can see Johnny C. on the 3rd line has an asterisk next to applesauce, indicating that that is the parent-provided component. And in this case, that is the only component because the formula has been provided by the center, and so this meal would be considered reimbursable and is counted at the top in the total reimbursable meals for the center. This same format would continue for lunch and snack on the same day. One final example of infant documentation that a center might use is shown on the screen. This form would allow a center to keep one piece of paper per infant per meal period per month for the purpose of documenting infant meals. Again, this sample does not provide teachers with the minimum meal pattern requirements and would require specific training to ensure that the form is filled out completely and correctly. In this example, our sample infant is right around the 6-month mark. The meals documented continue to include the specific food item and quantity offered each day. Because Johnny is just showing signs of developmental readiness, you can see that additional foods are introduced slowly, but that each day is consistent with and/or builds upon the prior serving day's habits, increasing until the meal pattern requirements are met. Because these meals are consistent with the infant's eating habits and are driven by his developmental readiness cues, along with parent communication, these meals would all be considered reimbursable. A pattern that shows continued introduction of solid foods in increasing amounts, but then suddenly reverts back to breast milk only would not be considered consistent with the infant's eating habits and would likely be questioned on review. If a situation like this were to arise as a result of communications with the parent, a best practice would be to document that conversation either in the infant's file or directly on the meal recording form to prevent the disallowance of meals during an administrative review. Note that this form could be used as a planned menu for teachers and could be typed with the planned components ahead of time. If that were to be the case, teachers then would only be responsible for including the asterisks for parent-provided components and writing the actual amount offered and substituting in any specific food items if your planned menu were only to include things like fruit, as opposed to, again, writing the specific words applesauce. Or you could provide this as a blank calendar, again, assuming that your teachers have been properly trained and they can fill in the information individually as shown on the screen. Copies of each of these sample documentation forms, as well as additional infant resources, can be found on the RIDE Child Nutrition website at the link shown on the screen. As I mentioned, there is not one required form that must be used for infant meal documentation. Centers may elect to create their own forms, but are encouraged to seek RIDE approval before implementation to ensure compliance. In addition to saving individual infant meal documentation, remember that RIDE may also request nutrition labels for the iron-fortified infant formula in use and for yogurt and cereal to confirm compliance with the sugar requirements. This concludes the training on the new infant meal patterns for Child and Adult Care Food Program. Please contact a RIDE program specialist with any questions. Thank you.